Hi, I'm Janine Purves and I'm a CFP and have worked with many families in estate planning for all of the years I've been in the business. And I have found that it's such a difficult time when you lose a loved one. But what makes it even more difficult is trying to follow through on the will and what is happening in the bigger picture. It causes grief and challenges amongst family like I have never seen through anything else. And today I'm here to talk about that and helping through that process in a much broader way with Mallory McGrath. I met Mallory a couple months ago, and she is the founder and CEO of Viive Planning, and she has worked as an estate litigation clerk, which made her realize that families were battling over some of the smallest amounts of money and detail due to lack of communication from parents and adult children before their death. And she was inspired to help fill that gap in traditional estate planning and established Viive Planning to enable families to plan their future holistically and collaboratively. She's been doing this actively in her own business since November 2020, and she really wants to help avoid the destructive cocktail of grief and greed and have open conversations to help prepare them for that future stages of life. So Mallory, thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say to guide people in those last few stages when planning is required.
Thank you so much, Janine. I really appreciate you inviting me to be here and to share a little bit of knowledge and some tips and tricks with all of your viewers.
So let me just start simply by, how did you start this business? What was the real driver?
So, I mean, you mentioned when you were introducing me there, and thank you so much, was the fact that I was a litigation law clerk and we specialized in estate litigation. And so it really was breaking down a lot of the cases that I was working on and trying to figure out why the families were at that point. Why were brothers and sisters suing each other? Why were people fighting over who got to care for mom and dad? And I started to think maybe it's the lawyers' problems, maybe it's the financial advisors' problems, like who's doing this to families? And after I started breaking down a lot of these cases, I realized, you know what? It's the families themselves. It's them who are not taking the initiative to have these conversations early, way before they think they should be having them, and really making sure that that's a huge priority for a family. Then I took that and started reflecting on my own family and what it was like. And I come from a blended family. There's a lot of kids and a lot of parents and a lot of step parents, and it just adds complexity. And even though we all get along and everything's good, that doesn't mean it'll stay that way forever. I think a lot of times families think that we're family, so we'll always love each other, we'll always get along, but that's just actually not how the world works. We have to actively work at the relationships that we care about having, and that includes our immediate family. So as I was doing all that reflecting, I was like, you know what? No one's really providing this very specific service of helping families to have these conversations. So why don't I do it? So enter Viive Planning. We were able to put together a really exceptional service for families. And as you said, we launched in November 2020 and haven't looked back, and have had a great time working with some really incredible families.
That's amazing. Um, I have been helping clients with estate planning now for over 20 years. And I do find that they just get stuck. They don't want to acknowledge that these things might happen. So that therefore the conversation doesn't happen. They, and then when they're in the middle of it, if they're the executor or trying to deal with some of these things after the fact, the communication breaks down because they don't even know how to initiate it. And most of that does start from way back because nobody talked about it, nobody brought it up. So one of the biggest roles that I take on as part of my duty as a CFP is trying to initiate those conversations so that the intent and how we want to move forward is there. And because I see such a stalemate, I guess I'm curious about what your step is in navigating people through this journey. How do you get them started?
Well, a lot of times it comes down to ripping the band-aid off in a way, but ripping it off and also doing it delicately, if you can imagine that dichotomy. So a lot of times what I do is when people come to work with me, they know what they're getting into. I make it pretty clear up front that this isn't going to be necessarily fun, although we'll do our best to have a good time. This is going to really push a lot of limits and boundaries that you have as a person on who you communicate with, on what you communicate about, on what you allow yourself to think about, which is really the big one to begin with, because a lot of this process is self-reflection. You know, we as a society have been taught to not think about death or getting old. And if you do, then you're depressing and you're being negative and you shouldn't do that. But really, you know, if you look at life as a whole, you are born, you grow up, you get old, and you die. I mean, that's your journey. The only way you don't age is if you die young. So I always remind people that getting old is a privilege. It is not a right. Whereas everyone can know, everyone watching right now, you are all going to die one day. There's no escaping it. No one's figured that out yet. So you might as well just dive into that thought every once in a while. And what I find it does personally for myself is it really makes me look at my own life and reflect on it, right? Knowing that I will die one day, knowing that I could die next week even, you know, get hit by that proverbial bus. Well, what am I doing right now in my life to enjoy it, to plan for things in the future, to make sure that my family is safe and secure around me? That's really key. So a lot of times when I'm with clients, you know, we start off easy, we go in a little bit, we experiment with some topics and certain word choices, but then eventually you really do have to rip the Band-Aid off. And that can be a process in and of itself. There can be some really intense reactions to talking about some of these topics. But what I find is, which I think is really key, is you ask the hard questions, and then as a practitioner, I walk away. Unless someone has an answer very clearly in mind, it's best to give people time to absorb things, to let their brains, those little hamster wheels, spin for a few weeks on those topics that you put there, and then go in and reevaluate and rediscuss these topics. So I think what's interesting about our business model is that unlike some other estate planning providers where you're paying a very, very high rate to be with them for a specific amount of time, you feel the need to give them the answers that they need right then. We have a very long-term relationship. We take our time, we ease ourselves in, we get people comfortable with it. Because if I can get, say, a couple in their 60s comfortable with these topics, they're going to be able to turn around and educate their children in their 30s, who are then going to be able to educate their own children. And we'll see this really remarkable ripple effect when it comes to having topics, talking about aging and end of life.
I love that. One of the things that I know I've done is helping families to try to share what they want to have happen towards end of life and what they have planned for with their family and their kids. And there's a level of that is helpful, but I know that most people, when they think of estate planning or end of life planning, really all they do is think, do I have any insurance to cover me? And is it in the will? Because they just assume that, you know, I'm just going to die in my sleep one night. I'm not going to go through all that difficult part that, you know, I know my aunt had or somebody they know, which they didn't appreciate, but that's not going to happen to them. They're just going to fly to Switzerland or whatever they say. And I know that's not reality. So maybe share with us a little bit about your process and I guess the estate planning journey normally and how you can enhance that and where that comes in.
Sure. So as you said, most people think of estate planning as having a will, maybe having an insurance policy, maybe thinking about retirement planning. It's funny how people think about planning for retirement as being a part of estate planning. So, you know, it's usually just those small pieces. I say small, they're significant, but they're small pieces of the puzzle. So what a lot of people don't do is they don't plan to age, they plan to retire. So that's a big piece of the puzzle that needs to be examined as well, that a lot of great financial advisors like yourself actually look at, is what does it cost to get old? Also, what does it cost to die? That's a big piece of the puzzle as well, is looking at that. So when people are avoiding these topics, it really limits the scope of what estate planning should be. And a lot of times that does fall on the practitioners, lawyers, advisors, insurance brokers, and accountants, the fact that they limit the scope of what estate planning is in terms of what their scope of knowledge is. But really we need to be looking at it in a much larger way, and that's where Viive comes in. So we are looking at all of those topics, the legal, the financial, the insurance, the accounting, and we're connecting our clients with exceptional trusted partners like yourself to make sure that they are getting that specific service. So that one piece of the puzzle is being taken care of. But there's still a whole host of other pieces down here that actually aren't being dealt with by those main, shall we say, core service providers in the estate planning industry. So we need to start talking about what aging will look like, those active aging years. Are you going to live at home? Are you going to move to a retirement residence? If so, have you looked at retirement residences in your area? If not, maybe we connect you with a senior transition specialist. Maybe we connect you with a real estate agent who's going to help you to downsize and sell your home. We also look at the idea of medical intervention. So if you are rushed to the hospital after a car accident, do you want CPR? Do you want a feeding tube? Do you want any other form of life-saving measures? We then also look at actively at end of life. If you find out you have cancer and you're going to die in 3 months, what do those 3 months look like for you? What's important to you and your family? Where do you die? How does that process occur? And then obviously we talk about the after death element. So it's really a lot more than traditional estate planning providers do provide, not necessarily because they don't want to, but a lot of times because it's out of their scope. It's out of what their billable hours generally entail, right? And so by giving the time that's needed, because this is not a fast process, and also giving a much more holistic and well-rounded approach to estate planning, our hope at Viive is that we can help a lot of families to avoid grief and greed and jealousy and a lot of confusion that can come with an aging population slowly aging through their later years and eventually dying.
Thank you. That was so helpful in just giving us that extra perspective. I guess if a client, now I know you deal with families directly and you help them, but you also deal with some, I'll say, trusted partners, as you referred to them. So maybe explain a little bit about, you know, if somebody has a financial advisor and also has their last will and testament done, you know, maybe what is there left to do, and where would you come into the process?
Right. So a lot of times clients are referred to us by a lawyer or by a financial advisor or planner. And so, you know, we take a look at what's been accomplished, right? So if a lawyer sends them and they're like, we just did their will, or we're about to do their will, which is the most common occurrence, is that the lawyer recognizes that more conversation needs to take place that the lawyer doesn't want to take on, then they're passed to us to dive into those topics. It really is a lot of the things that I'd mentioned before. It's talking about the aging process and what that looks like. It's diving into family dynamics. So a lot of times, say you have a couple in their late 60s who have 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. A lot of times they're going to say, okay, well, our son, the oldest, will be the executor and also be our power of attorney for property and personal care. And most lawyers out there, and advisors for that matter, will say, okay, because there's nothing wrong with that. There's no reason necessarily to take it a step further. But at Viive, our response would be, why? I mean, why are you picking your son? Is it because he's your only son? Is it because he's the firstborn child? Because these aren't necessarily reasons to pick him for a position of power, very significant power in your life and in your death. If you're picking him because he's an accountant and because he lives the closest of the 3 kids, well, those are good reasons, right? Those reasons make sense. You know, a lot of times people pick their firstborn daughter to do things. Traditionally, daughters are in very nurturing roles when it comes to aging parents, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she should be picked, right? She has 5 kids. Maybe we shouldn't pick her. She's got things going on, right? Maybe we pick the second daughter because she doesn't have any children and will have more time to give to that caregiving role. So it's really diving into the why of a lot of questions that a lot of times traditional service providers don't go into, because if an answer is given that seems logical enough and legally is allowed, well, then why take it a step further? Why broach that very intimate and uncomfortable subject of family dynamics? But at Viive, that's our bread and butter. We want to dive in and get to know what those relationships are like, because really helping families to understand the different roles that they have within their family unit a lot of times will help to eliminate the possibility of any sort of confusion and jealousy in the future.
Thank you. That is, I find it so helpful because I'm constantly amazed at the challenges that do come up after, and also the reasons people are choosing. Oh, well, I want to be fair to everybody, so all 3 of them should be executors.
Right.
Okay, do they get along? That means 3 signatures. Like, there's so many extra steps to consider, and it's funny. And then they also think somebody who has to be really financially savvy. And I'm actually starting to change that thought process with many of
Mm-hmm.
the people I'm dealing with, that I actually think it's somebody who is able to pull them together a bit better might be a better executor, because they can
Mm-hmm.
always hire somebody to help with the financial pieces. So
Exactly.
it's the communication and making sure they're moving forward. So having somebody who's an organizer
Mm-hmm.
and making sure some of those steps are getting checked off is more important than somebody who happens to be good with spreadsheets, but they're so busy they don't actually get to it.
Exactly. That's something I say a lot of times. I prefer that people pick someone that they think can emotionally handle the job, not that they can technically handle it. I mean, if they're known for, they lost a bunch of money in the stock market, well, maybe we talk about that as a difference. But really, at the end of the day, if someone has the organizational and emotional capability to do an incredibly stressful job and have to be the person in charge of their other siblings and the future of their other siblings, then that's the person to be picking, right? As you said, you can be working with your parents' financial advisor right before and after death. You can be hiring accountants. You don't need to know how to do that part. You just need to make sure there's enough money in the estate to ensure that that can be serviced.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tell us, I guess the last question, I know people are scared. They don't want to talk about this because they don't want to be a burden to their family. That is
Mm-hmm.
probably the most common unsaid thing that starts to come out over time. So are there ways for them to avoid becoming a burden?
That's such a triggering word for people, burden. So I'll just lay the truth out here. If you become an elderly person, if you are lucky enough to become an elderly person, you are going to be a burden. So you might as well just get comfortable with that. But let's think of it this way. Do we look at babies and toddlers and think that they are burdens? No, we don't, right? They are at an age and stage of their life where they require support, where they require you to make sure they get the right dose of Tylenol when they have a fever, that they need help with toileting and potty training and feeding themselves and everything. And we don't think of them as burdens. And I'm not saying that we should compare elderly people to babies, because there's the powder keg right there, but they similarly, the elderly people are at an age and stage in their life where they require support from other people. And there's no shame in that. And that's something we need to do, is take the shame out of the word burden, or just stop using the word burden altogether. Really, you are just at a time in your life where you need support. And a big thing that comes out of conversations I have with clients is they say, I don't want to talk to my children or my family about these topics because then I'm being a burden to them. And so then I give them a plethora of examples of what actually a burden is. A burden is your mom having a stroke and you having to take 2 weeks off work so that you can find PSWs to care for her, get her into a rehab program, sell her home, move her to long-term care. Like those things are being a burden. But you knowing that your family has a history of strokes, or you have an issue with strokes yourself, planning for that possibility happening and communicating those wishes to your family, that is not you being a burden. That is you just planning ahead and making sure that things are taken care of, so that if the unfortunate situation occurs, which hopefully it doesn't, everyone's ready to go. And when bad things happen to our parents or to our grandparents, there's so much emotion tied up in that, right? And so a lot of times we see people making decisions that are incredibly emotionally charged. And the problem with that is that that's where the fighting begins. That's where you get siblings disagreeing about whether or not mom should have that feeding tube in or not. But if mom has already said, I don't want a feeding tube, then there doesn't need to be a conversation. It's just, yes, doctor, I'm signing on the dotted line as the power of attorney for personal care. Don't give the feeding tube. We understand that she will die. Don't give her the feeding tube. And there doesn't need to be a conversation. It's just an actual execution of wishes that have already been articulated at a time when everyone was happy, healthy, and on board. So that's a really, really key thing that people need to realize, is you're going to be a burden at some point in your life. You've already been one, and you're going to be one again. So you might as well get comfortable with that idea. And to be less of a burden, you need to be planning, you need to be thinking about those difficult topics, and then you need to be communicating them to your family around you.
I want to just touch on what you just said about choosing the feeding tube, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been in that situation. My father had a massive stroke, and we were in the hospital having to make life or death decisions
Mm-hmm.
based on what the doctors are telling us. And he was older, but he wasn't that old.
Right.
And honestly, they knew he could recover. As a daughter, I can't take away the opportunity for him to recover and not give
Mm-hmm.
him certain life-saving techniques.
Mm-hmm.
He never did recover fully. And
Mm.
but I couldn't live with the position of me making that decision. There was no
Right.
way. And I
Exactly.
know he lived 5 years as fully paralyzed, and it was
Mm.
not a nice life. And, you know, if we'd known things differently or planned differently, that would have been a much easier decision for us to make. But the thing
Mm-hmm.
is, we think the doctors are going to tell us.
Yeah.
If there's a possibility they're going to survive whatever
Mm-hmm.
incident has just happened, that's what they tell you.
Yeah.
They're not going to make it easy for you to make that decision. So these
No.
conversations are so much more critical.
They are. And I'm so sorry that that happened to you, but it's incredible, right? Like your example is a example of the grief that you will have, forever, knowing that those last 5 years weren't his best 5 years, right? He could have potentially gone out on a different note, right? But it's a prime example, your story, that happens a lot. And doctors are trained to be optimists all the time. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If there's a slim chance that someone's going to recover, they're going to say yes. The degree of which they'll recover, that's a whole other story. So having those decisions made ahead of time is so vital for families.
So on that note, if somebody is thinking that this might be something that they want to take advantage of,
Mm-hmm.
Mallory will share your contact information at the end of this video. But
Great.
do you have anything you want to leave them with?
Sure. I think the big thing to remember is that, you calling up Viive or you sending us an email, it is a big deal. And it might take you some time to recognize that you're ready to do it or even to press the send button, because it is an investment in your future, both financially and from a time perspective and from a huge emotional perspective. And that can be a really difficult thing to do. But, for those of you watching, you have families, you have children, you have parents still living possibly, you know how important these conversations are. At the heart of it, you do know. And you know that if you can invest the time and money now, that there'll be so much more peace of mind in the future. So I encourage you to reach out. We always take calls in first meetings. We do not charge for them because we want people to feel comfortable with us and make sure that we are the right fit for them. So I encourage you to reach out, even if you just have questions, because we'd be happy to speak with you.
So we also leave you with two resources. One is, should you be planning for your future now? And some key questions that Mallory's put together to identify if some of these services might be appropriate for you and your family. And we'll be sharing that resource with you on our website. And there's going to be a link at the end of the video. And the other item is support at Viive and how to prepare to have a conversation with your family and loved ones about your aging and end of life process. And that will be available on our website as well as a link to Mallory's website, Viive Planning. So
Mm-hmm.
Mallory, I thank you for your time. Did you have any closing comments?
No, not at all. I thank you so much, Janine. The work you are doing with your clients and your community is incredible. And I hope that anyone watching who isn't working with Janine should be jumping on board. So please make sure you give her a call as well, because I'm sure together we'd be able to make sure that everyone has some great peace of mind for their future.
Yeah, it's so important. Thanks a
Mm-hmm.
lot. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.